Have you ever reached a point where maintaining your friendships, answering messages, and showing up as yourself felt like the hardest job you've ever had? Not because people were bad to you, but because the person they knew wasn't real anymore, and you didn't have the energy to explain that, defend it, or watch them try to pull you back into who you used to be. So instead of negotiating your exit or offering explanations no one would understand anyway, you just stopped. You went quiet. You disappeared. People who've never done this call it selfish, immature, or cruel. But people who have done it know the truth. Sometimes disappearing isn't about rejecting others, it's about refusing to keep performing a version of yourself that's killing you from the inside. Stay until the end, because we're breaking down the psychology of people who disappeared from everyone's life, and why that silence is often the loudest act of self preservation they've ever made. Most people assume that when someone disappears from everyone's life, something terrible must have happened: a breakdown, a betrayal, a spiral. Sometimes that's true, but often the truth is quieter and more deliberate. The person they knew wasn't real anymore, and you couldn't keep pretending just to keep the peace. People who disappear from everyone's life aren't always running from toxicity or trauma. Sometimes they're running from a version of themselves they built to fit into spaces that no longer serve them. And instead of explaining that to 20 different people who will each have an opinion about it, they choose silence. They choose distance. They choose themselves. Stay until the end of this video, because once you understand the psychology of people who disappeared from everyone's life, you'll see that what looks like abandonment is often the beginning of the most honest version of themselves they've ever allowed to exist. Let's start with what this actually feels like. Picture yourself a year ago, maybe two. You were social. You showed up to things. You texted back. You had inside jokes, regular plans, group chats that moved fast. From the outside, you looked connected. But somewhere along the way, you started noticing a gap between who you were becoming, who everyone expected you to stay. Maybe you started questioning beliefs you used to share with your friend group. Maybe you outgrew habits everyone else still celebrated. Maybe you realized the conversations that used to energize you now left you feeling empty. You weren't angry at anyone. You weren't trying to be difficult. You were just changing, and the people around you were expecting the old version to keep showing up. This wasn't you being fake or two-faced. This was the slow, uncomfortable process of outgrowing a role you didn't consciously choose. Every time you laughed at a joke that didn't land for you anymore, every time you nodded through advice that no longer made sense, every time you performed interest in things that no longer mattered, you were maintaining a version of yourself for other people's comfort. Psychologically, this is what identity reconstruction looks like in its early stages. You're not fully the person you were, but you're not yet the person you're becoming. And the gap between those two selves creates exhaustion that most people can't see from the outside. Now let's talk about the tipping point. There's usually a moment, sometimes quiet, sometimes obvious, when you realize that explaining yourself will cost more than disappearing. Maybe someone asks, "Why have you been so distant?" And you know that the real answer would take hours and still wouldn't be understood. Maybe you sit in a room full of people who love the old you, and you feel completely alone. You imagine what it would take to stay. The conversations where you'd have to defend why you're different now. The reassurances you'd owe people who feel abandoned by your growth. The constant negotiation between who you're becoming and who they want you to stay. And you realize you don't have the energy for that. You realize that staying would mean betraying yourself in ways you can't afford anymore. This wasn't you being selfish. This was self-preservation. You weren't ghosting to hurt anyone. You were stepping back because continuing to perform a version of yourself that no longer existed felt like dying slowly in front of people who couldn't even see it happening. Psychologically, this is what radical self-preservation looks like. When the cost of maintaining relationships is the erosion of your evolving identity, disconnection becomes the only honest option. It's not that you stopped caring. It's that caring for yourself finally became more urgent than managing everyone else's comfort with your transformation. Then there's the question, why not just explain? Why not tell people you're going through something, that you need space, that you're changing? For some people, that works. But for others, especially those who've spent years people pleasing or over explaining themselves, the idea of justifying their absence feels like one more performance they can't give. You know that if you explain, people will try to fix you, pull you back, or convince you that you're just going through a phase. They'll offer advice rooted in who you used to be. They'll remind you of all the good times, as if nostalgia should be enough to keep you tethered to a version of yourself you've outgrown. And you'll end up defending your right to evolve, which defeats the entire purpose of leaving. So instead, you go quiet. You stop posting. You stop replying. You let the silence do the work that words never could. It's not that you owe no one an explanation. It's that you've learned explanations don't always lead to understanding, and sometimes protecting your peace means disappointing people who expected more from you. People who disappear aren't always avoidant or emotionally immature. Many of them have tried the healthy communication route and discovered that some transformations can't be explained in ways that feel fair to both sides. So they choose themselves even when it looks cold from the outside. Fast forward to now, people who disappeared from everyone's life are often judged harshly. They're called flaky, selfish, cowardly. People say they just cut everyone off without a word, as if that decision was casual or careless. But most people who disappeared didn't do it lightly. They did it after months, maybe years, of feeling misaligned, unrecognized, or exhausted by the gap between who they were and who everyone needed them to be. They aren't incapable of loyalty. They aren't running from accountability. They aren't trying to hurt anyone. They've simply reached a point where maintaining connections built on an outdated version of themselves felt more dishonest than leaving. They chose radical self preservation over performance. They chose the discomfort of being misunderstood over the agony of being seen as someone they're not. They walked away from friendships that weren't bad, just incompatible with the person they were becoming. They figured out something most people resist, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for others is to stop pretending. Not every relationship is meant to survive your evolution, and clinging to connections that require you to stay small, stay the same, or stay silent about who you're becoming isn't connection, it's containment. That's not ghosting, that's choosing yourself. One where you're not running away from people, you're running toward the version of yourself you've been too afraid to become while everyone was watching. And once you see that disappearing was an act of self preservation, not cruelty, you stop feeling guilty for it. You start understanding that some chapters close without a goodbye, and that's not abandonment, that's evolution.